The crystal-bright morning light flooded the rooftop restaurant, pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows and turning every glass, every polished plate, every drop of water into a shard of white gold glare. It was the kind of place where the air felt rehearsed, soft classical music drifting from hidden speakers, linen folded with museum-level precision, and servers trained to move like they weren't allowed to disturb the air. And in the middle of all that elegance stood Elena Moretti, 62, hair pinned in a neat bun, uniform crisp but well-worn at the seams. She moved with a steady grace that came from decades of work, not luxury. Every step measured, every gesture gentle. People often mistook her for fragile. They didn't know she had weathered storms. Most of these guests had only watched in movies. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. At table 14, an elderly woman sat wrapped in a cream shawl. Her silver hair framed a soft, dignified face, and her hands trembled slightly as she tried to communicate something to her son. The man beside her, a sharp, impeccably groomed billionaire in a navy suit, was scanning the menu without really seeing it. His jaw was tight, his eyes shadowed with impatience, and something else. Exhaustion, maybe. Or fear. He didn't notice Elena approaching, but his mother did. The older woman reached out, fingertips brushing Elena's hand. Her eyes pleaded more clearly than any spoken language. Elena leaned down to her level, the restaurant noise washing away as if someone had lowered the volume knob on life itself. And then Elena spoke. Not in English, not in the polite, neutral tone she used for guests, but in warm, flowing, Italian, soft, melodic, the kind a mother would use to soothe a frightened child. The elderly woman's face lit up instantly, recognition blooming like sunlight after winter. She squeezed Elena's hands with surprising strength, answering her rapidly, gratefully, as though she had been waiting years for anyone to speak to her in the language of her memories. And that was the moment the billionaire looked up. His menu slipped from his fingers. His mouth parted in shock. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. He watched his mother, who had barely spoken for days, suddenly come alive, speaking with clear emotion, gesturing with the same hands that moments ago were trembling with frustration. The transformation was so swift, so profound, that the man could only stare at Elena as though she had resurrected something he thought was lost forever. That, he finally managed, his voice cracking. "You're speaking Italian to my mother?" Elena straightened, but she didn't back away. "I only wanted to understand her," she said quietly, "and to let her feel understood." He blinked, stunned, eyes flicking between the two women. "How do you know Italian? Who taught you?" The question wasn't sharp, if anything. It sounded like disbelief wrapped in hope. Before Elena could answer, his mother tugged at her sleeve again, whispering another phrase in Italian, something tender, almost tearful. Elena replied gently, translating the emotion through tone even before words. And the billionaire was no longer just watching. He was unraveling. He saw his mother's eyes glisten, her shoulders relax for the first time in months. He saw Elena's steady presence, her calm warmth, her hands cradling his mother's, as though she had always belonged in that seat beside them. A server in the back nearly dropped a tray. Two guests at another table paused mid-sentence. Even the soft music seemed to hush. Something extraordinary had just happened, something that cut through power, wealth, pressure, and fear. Something only kindness could do. As Elena gently guided the elderly woman through another Italian phrase, the billionaire leaned back, exhaling shakily, as if life had just handed him an answer he'd been searching for far too long. He didn't know it yet, but this moment would change everything. And by the end of the day, Elena would find a plane ticket and a sealed note waiting for her left by the very man staring at her now like she had just opened a door he never knew existed. The restaurant settled into a fragile stillness as Elena gently withdrew her hands from the older woman's grasp, trying to compose herself even as the warmth of that unexpected connection lingered across her skin like a quiet echo from a life she thought she had already closed the door on. The billionaire watched her with an intensity that felt almost overwhelming. Yet Elena stood upright with the graceful steadiness of someone who had spent decades balancing trays heavier than most people's worries, refusing to let her emotions betray the sudden tremor in her heart. She offered a soft smile to reassure the elderly mother, whose eyes still shimmered with gratitude, before adjusting her apron with practiced precision, subtly grounding herself against the polished marble floor that gleamed like a mirror beneath the cascading light from the rooftop windows. The gentle clink of glassware filled the silence as Elena began setting fresh cutlery with deliberate care, each placement measured and quiet, while the distant hum of morning traffic drifted faintly through the tall panes of glass that framed the skyline far below. The billionaire's stare followed her with a mixture of confusion, curiosity, and something more vulnerable, but Elena forced herself to keep her focus on the small tasks that gave structure to her day, rearranging a linen napkin here and straightening a water glass there, all while fighting the uneasy awareness that her private world had been pierced open far too quickly. She had always preferred to blend into the soft edges of the dining room, moving like a shadow that offered service without demanding attention, yet now she felt impossibly exposed beneath the billionaire's sharpened gaze. He finally cleared his throat in a way that seemed uncharacteristically hesitant for a man of such obvious power, causing Elena to glance up just as he tried to adjust his cufflink, though his hands were not as steady as he seemed to expect them to be. His mother reached for her teacup with a tender smile, quietly humming a melody in Italian that drifted lightly between them like a thread binding their shared memories, and Elena could sense how deeply it affected him, even though he tried to maintain the polished composure expected of someone in his public position. She stepped slightly to the side, preparing to bring the tea service cart for the next part of their meal, when he spoke again with a voice so low it almost blended into the quiet elegance of the restaurant, asking if Elena might stay for another moment because his mother appeared calmer with her nearby. Elena hesitated only briefly before giving a respectful nod, moving closer in slow, gentle steps that revealed nothing of the sudden flutter in her chest, positioning herself where the mother could see her without straining her neck or shifting uncomfortably. The billionaire leaned forward with his elbows resting near the edge of the table, his fingers interlaced tightly as he studied Elena with eyes that seemed to balance wariness and need, like a man realizing he was at the mercy of someone who held something precious that he had not felt in years. He whispered that his mother rarely spoke more than a few fragmented sentences these days, and that hearing her talk so clearly, even briefly, felt like witnessing a piece of her old spirit return from a faraway place he thought had been lost forever. Elena swallowed gently and kept her expression soft, reminding herself that compassion was not a weakness, even though experience had taught her that offering too much of herself often led to wounds that healed far slower than she ever expected. She explained, as carefully as she could, that she had lived in Florence with her late husband for many years, and that the language still lived inside her like a soft flame she carried quietly through her life, one she never truly extinguished, even after returning to the United States, under circumstances she rarely discussed. As she spoke, the billionaire's mother reached for her again with a fragile hand, whispering something delicate and heartfelt in Italian that made Elena's breath catch subtly, because the older woman's words carried the unmistakable tremor of longing, memory, and gratitude, all woven into a single fragile thread. She offered a soft smile to reassure the elderly mother, whose eyes still shimmered with gratitude, before adjusting her apron with practiced precision, subtly grounding herself against the polished marble floor that gleamed like a mirror beneath the cascading light from the rooftop windows. A few guests seated nearby tried to appear discreet, yet the shift in atmosphere was impossible to ignore, because something extraordinary was unfolding in front of them, something private, something brave, something more human than any display of wealth or status swirling around the dining room that morning. The moment felt suspended in time, held together by tenderness and memory, while Elena silently wondered whether she had crossed an invisible line that separated personal truth from professional duty, unsure if the consequences would fall gently or strike without warning. The billionaire finally exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if trying to steady himself against an emotional weight he rarely allowed the world to see, before thanking Elena with a tone layered in sincerity so raw it momentarily stripped him of the commanding authority that clung to him like an expensive suit. She responded with modest humility, reassuring him that she had only wished to ease his mother's distress, though inside her chest a quiet ache stirred one, born from remembering how easily kindness could reopen rooms of the heart long abandoned. The mother's eyes drifted back toward the skyline, her fragile fingers still intertwined with Elena's, as though holding on to something she feared would disappear if she let go, while the billionaire observed the tableau in a silence filled with unspoken questions he seemed too afraid to ask. Elena straightened slowly, smoothing her apron again, and offered a final soft smile before stepping back with the steady dignity of someone who knew when to remain present and when to let others carry the moment themselves. Yet even as she returned to arranging the table with careful precision, she felt the billionaire's gaze linger on her like a quiet promise that their paths were far from finished weaving together, though neither of them yet understood how deeply this morning's unexpected encounter would reshape everything that followed. Elena moved quietly toward the service station, gathering a fresh pot of hot water and a selection of herbal teas, hoping to provide the billionaire's mother with something soothing, even as her heart continued beating with the steady ache of a memory she had tried to keep locked away for so many years. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. At table 14, an elderly woman sat wrapped in a cream shawl. The older woman whispered a hesitant phrase in Italian, her voice thin but resolute, asking whether the tea might include a hint of lemon because it reminded her of her late husband, whose memory she clung to through subtle sensations rather than fading photographs. Elena nodded with soft understanding, replying in Italian with a gentle cadence that carried the comforting familiarity of someone who genuinely cared, explaining that she would bring freshly sliced lemon to brighten the tea just the way the older woman preferred. The billionaire watched silently, his expression shifting ever so slightly as he observed the effortless connection unfolding between his mother and the waitress. A connection built on empathy rather than obligation, and it unsettled him in ways he was not prepared to articulate. He leaned back in his chair, studying Elena, with eyes sharpened by curiosity, noticing the subtle way she held her shoulders when she spoke Italian, as though the language lived not only on her tongue but deep within the fabric of her identity, woven through years of loss, love, and unspoken resilience. His mother reached for Elena's hand again, her fingers trembling with gratitude, and murmured that the sound of Italian made her feel young again, as if she were walking through the sunlit streets of Florence where her heart had once belonged. The words pierced Elena gently but deeply, stirring the memory of a life she once lived in those same narrow cobblestone streets, where her late husband had taught her to savor every morning, as though it were a gift rather than a routine. She steadied herself, offering a quiet smile that hid the fragile tremor gathering behind her ribcage, and responded that Florence had a way of imprinting itself on whoever loved it, leaving traces that no amount of distance or time could fully erase. The billionaire shifted forward, elbows resting near the edge of the table, as he asked with controlled curiosity how Elena knew the city so intimately, though his tone carried an underlying note of fascination he could not conceal. She hesitated, her gaze momentarily drifting toward the panoramic windows where the skyline shimmered beneath the late morning sun, before explaining softly that she and her late husband had lived in a small apartment overlooking the Arno River during the early years of their marriage, building a life filled with simplicity rather than wealth. His mother reached for her teacup with a tender smile, quietly humming a melody in Italian that drifted lightly between them like a thread binding their shared memories, and Elena could sense how deeply it affected him, even though he tried to maintain the polished composure expected of someone in his public position. Elena set the tea tray before them with deliberate care, pouring hot water into a porcelain cup while her mind replayed fragments of her past, her husband's laughter echoing against the stone bridges of Florence, the scent of lemon groves drifting across summer evenings, and the quiet joy of reading books beneath a sunlit window where the curtains always fluttered in the breeze. She did not turn immediately, choosing instead to finish aligning the cutlery on the white linen cloth, but the air around her shifted subtly, charged with the presence of someone who carried authority like a second skin and rarely needed to announce his arrival. When she finally lifted her gaze, the billionaire stood only a few feet away, his posture poised yet strangely uncertain, as if he were navigating unfamiliar ground and was unsure whether he had the right to cross it. Elena swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the sincerity pouring from the older woman's words, and replied that she was honored to offer even a brief moment of comfort during a morning that seemed to grow more meaningful than she had anticipated. The billionaire's gaze softened visibly as he watched his mother sip the tea, her frail shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks, and he seemed to understand that Elena had given them something priceless, something neither money nor influence could ever replicate. He asked whether she would stay for just a moment longer to help translate a few sentences his mother struggled to express, and though Elena feared lingering too long at a single table might draw unwanted attention, she saw the silent plea in his eyes and found herself unable to refuse. She bent closer as the mother whispered again, listening carefully before translating each phrase with delicate precision, conveying the emotion behind the words with the same grace she used for their meaning. The billionaire's expression shifted from confusion to wonder, then to something almost reverent, as he realized he was hearing sentiments his mother had not been able to share with him in months, small memories, tender regrets, and gentle hopes spoken through Elena's unwavering patience. In that moment, Elena sensed the fragile boundary between guest and server beginning to blur, yet she remained steady, holding the space with quiet dignity as she guided the conversation with the compassion of someone who understood the intimate weight of care. The restaurant around them softened into a muted backdrop, fading into indistinct shapes and murmurs, as the three of them lingered in a fragile circle of emotion that felt strangely untouched by the world outside. Elena stepped away from the table with slow, measured breaths, trying to steady the quiet trembling in her chest as she arranged the empty saucers on her tray, though her mind remained anchored to the image of the billionaire watching her, as though she had just shifted the axis of his carefully controlled world. She moved toward the service station, hoping distance might help her regain her composure, yet she felt the weight of his gaze following her across the room like a silent thread pulling her back toward a place she had not expected to occupy. She began polishing a set of silver spoons with methodical precision, allowing the rhythmic motion to soothe the rising tension inside her, when she sensed footsteps approaching from behind, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably familiar in their confidence. Yet even as she returned to arranging the table with careful precision, she felt the billionaire's gaze linger on her like a quiet promise that their paths were far from finished weaving together, though neither of them yet understood how deeply this morning's unexpected encounter would reshape everything that followed. His hands rested loosely in his pockets, but there was a faint tightness in his shoulders that betrayed a tension he clearly wished to hide, and his eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her pulse stumble before she could gather herself. "I need to ask you something," he began quietly, his voice softened from the commanding tone he used earlier, as though he feared startling her or perhaps revealing too much of what he was feeling. Elena nodded patiently, folding the linen cloth with careful movements, trying to maintain the professional composure that had protected her through countless unexpected moments in her long career. He hesitated before continuing, an unusual flicker of vulnerability crossing his expression, as he asked where she had learned to speak Italian not only fluently, but with the precise inflection and warmth of someone who had lived within the language for decades. Elena felt her breath catch slightly, surprised by his careful phrasing, because it was clear he was not merely asking out of curiosity, but rather out of a deeper longing to understand something about her that had unsettled him in ways he perhaps did not yet fully grasp. The billionaire watched silently, his expression shifting ever so slightly as he observed the effortless connection unfolding between his mother and the waitress. A connection built on empathy rather than obligation, and it unsettled him in ways he was not prepared to articulate. The billionaire listened with rapt attention, leaning slightly closer as if the space between them felt too vast for the gravity of their exchange, his eyes tracing the subtle shifts in her expression, as though searching for clues to a story far larger than the few words she offered. He asked whether she missed Florence, his tone laced with a curiosity that seemed to reach beyond polite conversation, and Elena answered with a steady voice that she missed certain parts of her old life but had learned to hold those memories with gratitude rather than grief. Their eyes met for a brief, unguarded moment, and the air between them tightened with something tender yet fraught, like a note in a classical piece stretched to the edge of breaking before resolving into harmony. The billionaire cleared his throat gently, sensing the shift but unwilling to let it dissipate entirely, and asked whether his mother's words earlier had affected Elena in any particular way, because she had looked momentarily shaken when translating the older woman's memory of walking along the Arno River with her late husband. Elena considered her response carefully, aware that truth carried its own risks, yet she allowed a small, honest smile to surface, explaining that the memory his mother described reminded her of a similar walk she once took with her own husband on a warm evening when the city felt suspended between dusk and starlight. The billionaire exhaled slowly, absorbing her words like someone trying to understand the delicate architecture of another person's heart, and she wondered for a fleeting moment why a man of such immense wealth seemed so earnest in wanting to know the quiet details of her past. A soft shadow of a smile touched his lips as he admitted that he could not remember the last time his mother had spoken so clearly or with such vibrancy, and he confessed that he found it impossible to ignore the way Elena's presence seemed to draw something precious out of the older woman, something he feared had been fading beyond his reach. Elena lowered her gaze modestly, reminding him that she had only responded with kindness, yet she could not deny the warmth that spread across her chest at the sincerity in his voice, a warmth that startled her with its suddenness. The billionaire stepped a little closer, reducing the professional distance that usually anchored interactions between guests and servers, and for a moment she sensed a quiet energy swirling between them, an unexpected chemistry shaped not by romance but by recognition, like two people who had lived separate lives filled with grief, yet still carried the ability to understand one another without explanation. His voice dropped slightly as he asked what else she was hiding behind her calm demeanor and gentle smile, though the question held no accusation, only a soft fascination that unsettled her more than any harsh words could. Elena responded with a composed grace that masked the faint tremor in her voice, telling him that everyone carried stories they did not always share, but not all stories were meant to be opened in the middle of a work shift, especially when responsibilities demanded her attention. The billionaire's lips curved into a subtle, almost reluctant smile, acknowledging her boundaries with a quiet nod, yet she sensed that his interest in her had only deepened rather than diminished. Before he could speak again, his mother called out softly in Italian, reaching for him with a tenderness that instantly drew his attention, and Elena watched as he turned toward her, with a softened expression that revealed more about his heart than any words could. When he glanced back at Elena, their eyes met once more, and in that brief exchange, she felt the quiet certainty that this morning had shifted something irreversible not only for him but for her as well. As Elena moved away to attend another table, she sensed the billionaire's gaze lingering on her like a question left intentionally unanswered, a silent promise that their story had only just begun, weaving itself into the delicate loops of curiosity and connection forming between them. Elena moved toward the kitchen doors with her tray balanced carefully, hoping the short walk would help her regain the calm she prided herself on, though a faint pressure had begun to coil inside her chest, like a warning she couldn't yet name. As she reached the counter to return the empty cups, she sensed the shift in the atmosphere before she fully understood it, noticing the way two sharply dressed men standing near the entrance scanned the room with synchronized precision that felt more corporate than casual. The maître d', usually composed and unfazed by even the most demanding guests, stiffened subtly when he spotted them, lowering his voice as he approached them with a forced smile that failed to hide the anxiety tightening the corners of his mouth. Elena watched from the side, pretending to refill a small container of sugar packets while she listened to fragments of their conversation, catching the firm tone of one man who insisted on being taken immediately to the Caldwell table without offering his name or producing any reservation details. She recognized the last name instantly because the billionaire had introduced himself to the staff upon arrival with the quiet confidence of someone who rarely needed introductions, and the memory of his mother's fragile voice in her hands only moments ago made Elena's stomach tighten with unease. The maître d' gestured toward the table with polite reluctance, but his expression carried a silent plea for the rest of the staff to remain alert, as though he feared this unexpected visit might carry consequences none of them were prepared to handle. The two men moved through the dining room with a brisk, clipped stride, passing Elena without acknowledging her presence, yet their eyes flickered briefly toward her, with the cold efficiency of people trained to assess threats rather than acknowledge humanity. The billionaire noticed them before they reached him, his spine straightening with the reflexive rigidity of someone accustomed to guarding secrets he never intended to share publicly, and his expression tightened in a way that immediately unsettled Elena. His mother, still sipping her tea with serene contentment, did not notice the shift, but Elena saw the slight tremor in the billionaire's hand as he adjusted his napkin, signaling a controlled panic he clearly did not want the room to witness. One of the men leaned down to whisper something in his ear, and though their voices were too low for Elena to decipher, the billionaire's jaw locked with a tension so sharp it felt as if the air around them had suddenly chilled. The second man glanced around with an edgy impatience before fixing his gaze on Elena in a way that made her instinctively lower her eyes, feeling as though she had been scanned rather than simply observed. The billionaire's reply was quiet but carried enough frustration that Elena could hear the edge of it even across the room, and she saw the man shake his head firmly, gesturing discreetly toward the mother as though her presence complicated something they had been ordered to address. The billionaire's eyes darkened with irritation, yet he nodded reluctantly, signaling that he understood the severity of whatever information they had brought him, though Elena sensed he despised their timing more than their message. The men withdrew to the edge of the dining room, giving him space yet keeping a watchful proximity that suggested their news was both urgent and unwelcome, and Elena realized with a heavy certainty that this interruption was not a coincidence, but part of a larger storm brewing beneath the polished surface of his controlled life. She returned to wiping the service counter, even though her hands shook faintly, trying to hide the growing dread inside her chest, because she understood intuitively that something around this family was dangerously unsettled. The billionaire ran a hand through his hair with a weary frustration that momentarily stripped him of his powerful veneer, revealing a man trapped in a tightening circle of obligations, expectations, and secrets that seemed to claw at him from every angle. His mother looked up with a gentle smile, unaware of the tension threading through the room, and Elena felt her heart clench as she watched the billionaire force a reassuring expression he clearly did not feel. He excused himself from the table with an apology that carried a strained tenderness, promising his mother he would return in a moment, then stepped aside to speak with the two men, his voice low and taut, as he demanded answers he had not asked to receive. Elena could not hear his words, but she recognized the body language of someone fighting to contain a rising panic, and she wondered whether the gentle moment they had shared earlier had been nothing more than a fragile pause before reality intruded with ruthless timing. She noticed one of the men gesture toward a sleek black folder he carried under his arm, and when the billionaire reluctantly opened it, his expression hardened with a quiet devastation that made Elena's breath hitch, as though she were witnessing something she was never meant to see. Whatever was inside that folder seemed to strike at the very core of his life, because he closed it abruptly and pressed his fingers against his eyes, exhaling a ragged breath that betrayed the emotional blow he struggled to conceal. The men leaned closer, urging him with firm whispers that carried the unmistakable urgency of people delivering bad news, intertwined with orders. And though Elena looked away to avoid appearing intrusive, she could not unhear the faintly audible words drifting across the marble floor. Press leak, family health, and investors. Phrases sharp enough to paint a blurry yet alarming picture. Her pulse quickened with a sudden sense of protectiveness, because she understood instinctively that his mother was at the heart of whatever crisis was spiraling toward them with increasing speed. The billionaire eventually straightened, drawing a long, steadying breath as he forced his composure back into place like armor snapped onto a wounded soldier, and he returned to his table with a carefully neutral expression that failed to hide the storm gathering behind his eyes. Elena stepped forward discreetly, ready to assist if he needed anything. Yet she hesitated when he looked up at her with a gaze so conflicted, it felt as though he were silently pleading for a moment of stability in a world rapidly tilting off balance. She offered a small, respectful nod, silently letting him know she understood the gravity of his struggle without needing any explanation. And for a brief moment, she saw the tension in his shoulders ease, as though her presence alone offered a sliver of solace. But the weight of the unfolding crisis still lingered heavily between them, and Elena sensed with growing certainty that whatever came next would pull all three of them into a storm far larger than anyone in the room could yet comprehend. Elena stepped back from the Caldwell table with a careful breath, sensing the weight of the billionaire's hidden turmoil pressing against the fragile calm she had worked so hard to maintain throughout the morning, and she instinctively returned to the service station as though distance might help her steady the quiet tremor beginning to pulse beneath her ribs. She placed the polished teaspoons into their compartment one by one, listening to the soft metallic clicks that usually soothed her nerves, though today the familiar rhythm offered little comfort against the waves of memory slowly rising inside her. The moment she saw the billionaire press his fingers to his eyes earlier, something deep within her had shifted, stirring a tenderness she had spent years trying to bury beneath the routine of long shifts, quiet mornings, and the comforting predictability of a life lived in the background rather than the spotlight. She stood near the window where the warm sunlight spilled across the counter, like a soft invitation to pause, allowing herself a brief moment to breathe as she watched the city stretch endlessly below, pulsing with a vitality she once embraced fearlessly in her youth. Her hands pressed gently against the cool marble surface, and she found herself thinking of the narrow Italian streets where she had spent some of the happiest years of her life, walking beside her husband, as the world seemed filled with possibility, laughter, and the quiet confidence of two people certain they had found their place in the world. The memory of his warm voice brushing against her ear as he recited simple Italian phrases still lingered somewhere inside her, even though the years had softened the edges of his features in her mind, replacing vivid detail with gentle echoes that surfaced only when she allowed herself to remember. She blinked slowly, letting the image settle before pushing it away with the same practiced grace she used whenever memories threatened to spill into the present, because she had learned the hard way that indulging in what was lost did nothing but deepen wounds that never quite healed. Yet as she watched the billionaire lean toward his mother with a strained but tender expression, Elena felt a quiet ache rippling through her, a reminder that love, loss, and resilience were threads binding human beings more tightly than wealth, class, or polished exteriors ever could. She reached for a stack of freshly laundered napkins, folding each one with a precision that allowed her mind to drift, and she remembered the moment her husband fell ill, how the doctor's words had hung in the air like drifting ash, settling into corners of her life she hadn't realized were vulnerable until they began collapsing one by one. She had cared for him with unwavering devotion during those final months, speaking to him in Italian to remind him of their beginning, even as their ending approached with a quiet inevitability that neither of them dared to speak aloud. The restaurant's subdued chatter swirled around her like a distant melody, but Elena remained absorbed in the gentle rhythm of folding linen, trying to preserve the sense of stability she had spent years constructing after his passing, building a life held together by routine, determination, and a resilience she sometimes struggled to believe she possessed. She sighed softly, knowing that hidden beneath her calm exterior were countless unspoken stories she had chosen not to share, not because she lacked trust, but because she feared that opening old doors might cause the fragile structure of her rebuilt life to crumble. The assistant barely slowed as he approached, his expression tight with irritation, as he demanded to know why she had spent so long speaking with their table, implying with a tone sharpened by condescension that servers were expected to maintain boundaries rather than insert themselves into private family matters. He didn't speak at first, almost as though he sensed that interrupting her thoughts might shatter something delicate, and Elena lowered her eyes politely before straightening her posture, offering the practiced professionalism expected of someone in her position. He asked quietly whether she was all right, his voice carrying a depth of concern that surprised her, and she nodded with a gentle composure that concealed the faint tremor lingering beneath her calm. He apologized for the earlier intrusion caused by his associates, explaining that he had not anticipated their arrival, and Elena realized through his tone that the folder they had delivered contained something far more personal and painful than he had been ready to face during a public meal with his mother. She offered a soft assurance that she understood completely, because life had a way of rupturing calm moments without warning, and his shoulders seemed to relax as though her words had lifted a burden he had been carrying too tightly. He glanced toward his mother, who now rested with her eyes closed in serene comfort, before confessing that he had been terrified when her condition first began to worsen, because he feared losing the last living person who knew him before the world turned him into a symbol rather than a man. Elena listened with a compassion that felt both instinctive and deeply personal, sensing in his confession the same invisible ache she had once carried when her husband's health began to decline, a slow unraveling of certainty that left her clinging to moments rather than plans. She stepped a little closer and spoke softly, telling him that fear was often the first language spoken by those who loved deeply, and she saw in his eyes a flash of recognition, an unspoken understanding that connected them far more profoundly than any conversation they had shared so far. He hesitated before asking whether she had ever cared for someone through illness, and Elena felt her breath falter as she considered how much of her truth she was willing to reveal, knowing that vulnerability was a door that opened only one way and could not be closed again once its hinges loosened. She chose her words carefully, explaining that she had cared for her husband during his final years with a devotion that taught her more about strength, grief, and love than any other chapter of her life, and the billionaire listened with an intensity that reflected genuine respect rather than pity. For a moment, neither of them spoke as the soft clinking of cutlery drifted through the dining room, and Elena felt strangely grounded by his presence, as though sharing even a fragment of her past had eased a heaviness she had carried too quietly for too long. The billionaire whispered that her resilience humbled him, adding that he had met countless people in his world of influence and power, yet rarely encountered someone whose quiet strength seemed so authentically earned. Elena felt warmth bloom in her chest, unexpected, steady, and frighteningly gentle before she thanked him with a sincerity she could not suppress, knowing that his words touched a part of her she had kept hidden beneath years of silence. She returned to her tasks slowly, her hands steadying as she moved through the restaurant. Yet she sensed unmistakably that something between them had shifted once again, deepening through the shared language of loss, compassion, and the kind of human connection that transcended the boundaries of class, wealth, and circumstance. Elena had just finished arranging a set of clean wine glasses near the service counter when she noticed a sudden ripple of agitation move through the dining room, a subtle disturbance that rose like a draft beneath a closed door, quiet but unmistakably charged with tension. She lifted her eyes and saw the billionaire's assistant striding toward her with clipped, impatient steps, his posture rigid with entitlement and his gaze sharpened by the unmistakable confidence of a man accustomed to commanding immediate obedience from everyone around him. The assistant barely slowed as he approached, his expression tight with irritation as he demanded to know why she had spent so long speaking with their table, implying with a tone sharpened by condescension that servers were expected to maintain boundaries rather than insert themselves into private family matters. Elena stood completely still for a moment, absorbing the impact of his words with the practiced grace of someone who had endured far worse in her lifetime. Yet she felt a faint tremor of indignation flicker inside her chest as he continued lecturing her without pause or courtesy. He leaned closer, lowering his voice in a way that only intensified the sting of his accusation, insisting that her interaction with the billionaire's mother appeared inappropriate and unnecessary, as though kindness were somehow unprofessional or disruptive when directed towards someone deemed too important to be approached by ordinary staff. Elena held her breath briefly to steady her composure, then lifted her chin with a quiet dignity that she did not often display so openly, choosing her next words with the poise of someone who had learned to defend her integrity without raising her voice. The assistant's lips tightened as though he wished to argue further, yet he stepped back slightly when he noticed the unflinching steadiness in her eyes, a steadiness that hinted at experiences far beyond the scope of his narrow assumptions. Before he could regain the confidence to continue, the billionaire approached with long, determined strides, his expression darkened by a quiet fury that seemed carefully controlled, yet undeniably present, as though he had been watching the exchange long enough to understand exactly what was happening. His voice carried a cool, razor-sharp authority as he commanded the assistant to step aside immediately, reminding him with clipped precision that Elena had not overstepped anything, and that her presence had been both welcomed and necessary in helping his mother find her voice again. The assistant sputtered a half-formed protest, insisting that he had only been trying to protect the family's private matters, but the billionaire cut him off with a glare so piercing that several nearby guests paused mid-conversation, sensing the palpable shift in power dynamics unfolding before them. Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from shame, but from the unexpected weight of the billionaire's defense, an act both protective and quietly affirming that left her momentarily breathless as she tried to process the intensity of his words. He stepped closer to Elena, lowering his voice to offer a quiet reassurance that she had done nothing wrong, and that he was deeply grateful for the kindness she had shown his mother, emphasizing with a gentleness that contradicted his harsh reprimand of the assistant that her presence had meant more than she realized. The assistant stiffened as the billionaire dismissed him with a curt gesture, sending him stalking away with a mixture of resentment and humiliation etched across his rigid posture, leaving Elena alone with the man whose tenderness toward his mother had already begun softening the guarded edges of her heart. Elena swallowed slowly, steadying herself as she realized the billionaire was still watching her with an intensity that revealed far more than he intended, an expression that hovered somewhere between gratitude, fascination, and a fragile vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone to see. Elena stood completely still for a moment, absorbing the impact of his words with the practiced grace of someone who had endured far worse in her lifetime. Yet she felt a faint tremor of indignation flicker inside her chest as he continued lecturing her without pause or courtesy. Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from shame, but from the unexpected weight of the billionaire's defense, an act both protective and quietly affirming that left her momentarily breathless as she tried to process the intensity of his words. Their hands brushed gently as he released her wrist, an accidental yet unmistakable echo of connection that neither of them addressed openly, though the silence between them felt charged with the weight of unspoken questions and tentative beginnings. The tension eased slightly as Elena stepped back toward the service counter, but she could still feel the lingering imprint of his touch, a soft warmth that refused to fade even as she resumed folding napkins with deliberate care. Elena stood completely still for a moment, absorbing the impact of his words with the practiced grace of someone who had endured far worse in her lifetime. Yet she felt a faint tremor of indignation flicker inside her chest as he continued lecturing her without pause or courtesy. Elena tried to steady her breathing, reminding herself that she was simply a waitress performing her duties, but the calm veneer she wore so faithfully felt thinner than usual, stretched by emotions she had not invited yet, could no longer ignore. The billionaire remained near her for a few moments longer, offering a final look that carried gratitude, apology, and an unspoken question whose answer neither of them was ready to confront. When he eventually returned to his mother's side, Elena stood motionless for a brief suspended moment, realizing that the boundaries she had spent years respecting had just shifted irrevocably, drawn not by circumstance, but by the quiet intersection of dignity, conflict, and an unexpected flicker of connection. Elena remained at the service counter for a few moments longer than necessary, her hands moving with deliberate slowness as she stacked a set of white porcelain plates, hoping the repetitive motion might steady the flutter rising beneath her breastbone after the charged exchange with the billionaire and his assistant. She felt the faint imprint of his fingers lingering against her wrist like a warmth she had not expected, a warmth that unsettled her in ways she struggled to name, yet she forced herself to breathe steadily, reminding her heart that boundaries existed for a reason, and she had spent a lifetime honoring them. When she finally returned to the Caldwell table, carrying a refreshed pot of tea, she walked with the calm precision she had perfected through decades of service, though every step felt subtly heavier, as if the room had quietly shifted its gravity toward a moment she did not yet understand. The billionaire looked up immediately when she approached, and there was something softened in his eyes, an emotion shaped by exhaustion, gratitude, and a fragile sense of hope that seemed to flicker unsteadily beneath the weight of his responsibilities. His mother, now sitting more upright than before, greeted Elena with a tender smile that held both recognition and longing, her frail hand lifting slightly as though reaching for a familiar presence. Elena leaned closer with gentle attentiveness, pouring the fresh tea with a steady elegance that belied the quiet tremor building inside her chest. And when the older woman whispered something delicate in Italian, Elena instinctively bent down to catch the words that floated from her lips like fragile threads of memory. The elderly woman spoke of a garden she used to tend in Florence, describing the scent of lemon blossoms drifting across warm evenings and the way her late husband would hum softly while trimming the roses, creating a melody she had always believed would stay with her forever. The words carried a wistful yearning that made Elena's chest tighten, because the description mirrored almost perfectly the evenings she herself had lived in Italy many years ago, those slow sunsets filled with the gentle cadence of a life built on love, simplicity, and shared dreams. Elena translated the memories softly for the billionaire, her voice carrying the same tenderness she had heard in the older woman's words, and she watched as his expression shifted from curiosity to quiet ache, as though each fragment of recollection struck a deeper chord within him. He leaned forward with a reverence that revealed his longing to understand every detail his mother shared, even the ones he had never heard before, and Elena felt a swell of empathy rising within her, sensing the depth of his fear at losing the last pieces of the woman who had once shaped his world. As the mother continued speaking, her voice trembling with the fragile weight of nostalgia, Elena felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, not from sadness alone, but from the recognition of how human beings clung to the tender fragments of memory when everything else began to fade. She blinked them away quietly, unwilling to let her emotions intrude on the moment. Yet the billionaire noticed the subtle sheen in her gaze, his brows tightening with a tenderness that seemed to stir from a place he rarely allowed others to see. His mother reached for Elena's hand again, her fingers light but pleading, and she whispered another phrase in Italian, one filled with gratitude and vulnerability, telling Elena that hearing someone speak to her in a language she loved made her feel alive again, even if only for a moment. She blinked them away quietly, unwilling to let her emotions intrude on the moment. Yet the billionaire noticed the subtle sheen in her gaze, his brows tightening with a tenderness that seemed to stir from a place he rarely allowed others to see. Elena could see the shimmer of restrained tears gathering in his eyes, and though he blinked them away quickly, the vulnerability remained etched across his expression in a way that revealed just how profoundly this moment affected him. A quiet stillness settled around their table, softening the clinking of cutlery and the distant hum of conversations, creating a small sanctuary of shared humanity amid the polished luxury of the restaurant. Elena continued holding the mother's hand, translating her words with a care that carried far more than professional obligation, and she felt her own guarded heart begin to open in ways she had not allowed since her husband's passing, stirred by the quiet intimacy of two lives intertwined through memory and longing. When the older woman began to tire, Elena eased her hand gently onto the table and positioned the shawl more securely around her shoulders, her movements imbued with a tenderness that made the billionaire swallow hard as though witnessing something sacred. He whispered a quiet thank you, his voice roughened by emotion, and the sincerity in his tone felt like a warm balm settling over Elena's spirit, softening the heaviness she had carried for so many years. She offered him a small, steady smile, trying to maintain the professional boundary that grounded her, yet the connection lingering between them felt too genuine, too human, to dismiss as a simple interaction between server and guest. He studied her face for a moment, long enough for her breath to catch, then lowered his gaze toward the table as though overwhelmed by the depth of gratitude he could not fully express, and Elena felt a flutter of something unfamiliar begin to stir within her chest. The billionaire looked up immediately when she approached, and there was something softened in his eyes, an emotion shaped by exhaustion, gratitude, and a fragile sense of hope that seemed to flicker unsteadily beneath the weight of his responsibilities. His mother, now sitting more upright than before, greeted Elena with a tender smile that held both recognition and longing, her frail hand lifting slightly as though reaching for a familiar presence. Elena returned to the Caldwell table carrying a fresh set of porcelain saucers, moving with a measured grace that concealed the lingering thrum in her chest, though even as she approached, she sensed that something in the air between them had shifted into a state of fragile, expectant quiet. When the older woman began to tire, Elena eased her hand gently onto the table and positioned the shawl more securely around her shoulders, her movements imbued with a tenderness that made the billionaire swallow hard as though witnessing something sacred. He whispered a quiet thank you, his voice roughened by emotion, and the sincerity in his tone felt like a warm balm settling over Elena's spirit, softening the heaviness she had carried for so many years. His mother's eyes brightened when she saw Elena, a faint sparkle of recognition shimmering across her expression like sunlight glancing off rippling water, and she reached out again, with the same tentative tenderness she might offer a long-lost acquaintance suddenly found. Elena clasped the older woman's hand gently, her fingers soft yet steady, and she leaned in just enough for their eyes to meet on a level that carried both intimacy and comfort, allowing the moment to unfold naturally without forcing haste or interruption. The elderly woman began speaking in Italian once more, her voice fragile but filled with a wistful reverence, describing a memory that seemed to bloom slowly across her features, a memory so vivid and tender that Elena felt her breath catch before understanding a single word. The mother spoke of Florence again, of a small apartment overlooking a quiet river bend near a stone bridge, of the warm scent of basil drifting from open kitchen windows, of evenings filled with soft laughter echoing faintly through narrow cobblestone alleys. Elena's heart lurched as she listened, because the description matched a place she herself had once lived. A small neighborhood tucked between old stone walls and sun-warmed courtyards where she and her husband had built their quiet life. When the billionaire asked softly for a translation, Elena hesitated for a fleeting moment, not because she wished to hide the words, but because saying them aloud threatened to open a door she had kept closed for many long years. She finally translated with a steady voice, explaining that his mother was recalling a particular corner of Florence she had cherished deeply, a corner filled with memories of her husband and the early years of their life together. His voice carried a note of regret, and Elena sensed the invisible distance he had always felt between himself and his mother's memories, a gap carved not by indifference, but by circumstance, and the relentless demands of his family's legacy. Elena lowered her gaze, momentarily overwhelmed by a rush of old feelings she had not expected to confront today, before she nodded slowly and admitted that she had indeed lived in that very neighborhood, in an apartment just half a block from the home his mother was describing. His eyes widened with a mixture of surprise and wonder, as though he were witnessing the sudden convergence of two storylines that had until now existed separately, unaware of their eventual intersection. He asked how long she had lived there, and Elena answered softly that she had spent nearly 12 years in Florence, first as a young bride full of hope, and later as a devoted caregiver, walking beside her husband through the final chapters of his life. As she spoke, the older woman squeezed her hand with a tenderness that made tears sting at the corners of her eyes, and Elena felt the weight of shared loss and quiet endurance settle gently between them, like a thick but comforting shawl. The billionaire's expression softened even further as he listened, absorbing every detail with a depth of empathy she had not expected from someone whose life appeared so polished and distant from her own. He told her that he and his mother had visited Florence only occasionally when he was a child, staying primarily in the city center near the grand piazzas, which meant he had never truly known the intimate corners his mother described with such longing. His voice carried a note of regret, and Elena sensed the invisible distance he had always felt between himself and his mother's memories, a gap carved not by indifference, but by circumstance, and the relentless demands of his family's legacy. Elena found herself explaining the subtle rhythms of the neighborhood, the early morning church bells that chimed just slightly off-tempo, the tiny bakery that baked rolls so airy they collapsed beneath the lightest touch, the elderly violinist who played beneath the same lamppost for more than 30 years. The mother closed her eyes as Elena spoke, smiling as though each detail brought her gently back to a place she had believed she might never visit again. And this time the billionaire's breath hitched with emotion, realizing that Elena was not only translating words but resurrecting an entire world his mother had slowly begun to lose. The billionaire's expression softened even further as he listened, absorbing every detail with a depth of empathy she had not expected from someone whose life appeared so polished and distant from her own. He told her that he and his mother had visited Florence only occasionally when he was a child, staying primarily in the city center near the grand piazzas, which meant he had never truly known the intimate corners his mother described with such longing. His voice carried a note of regret, and Elena sensed the invisible distance he had always felt between himself and his mother's memories, a gap carved not by indifference, but by circumstance, and the relentless demands of his family's legacy. The mother reached up to brush Elena's cheek with her fingertips, tracing the line of her jaw in a gesture so unexpectedly tender that Elena nearly faltered, and she whispered that the softness in Elena's voice reminded her of the young Italian woman who once lived next door and often brought freshly baked bread to share on warm summer afternoons. Elena felt a tremor run through her as she translated this for the billionaire, because she remembered that neighbor vividly, the one who had taught her the best way to knead dough and once comforted her during her husband's early symptoms. For a long moment, the three of them existed in a quiet circle of shared memory, woven together by threads of places once cherished, people once loved, and moments that had shaped their lives in ways none of them fully understood until now. Elena tried to steady her breathing, reminding herself that she was simply a waitress performing her duties, but the calm veneer she wore so faithfully felt thinner than usual, stretched by emotions she had not invited yet, could no longer ignore. The billionaire remained near her for a few moments longer, offering a final look that carried gratitude, apology, and an unspoken question whose answer neither of them was ready to confront. And in that moment, she realized that the bond forming between them was not born merely of language or coincidence, but of the deep human longing to feel understood, remembered, and seen, even after years of drifting apart or surviving loss. He asked how long she had lived there, and Elena answered softly that she had spent nearly 12 years in Florence, first as a young bride full of hope, and later as a devoted caregiver, walking beside her husband through the final chapters of his life. As she spoke, the older woman squeezed her hand with a tenderness that made tears sting at the corners of her eyes, and Elena felt the weight of shared loss and quiet endurance settle gently between them, like a thick but comforting shawl. She moved toward the service counter with slow, careful steps, letting her hands settle onto the cool surface as she inhaled deeply, attempting to gather herself before returning to the rhythm of her duties. Yet the weight of what had just unfolded continued pulsing beneath her ribs with a quiet insistence. She had only begun to sort a tray of silver teaspoons when she noticed the billionaire's assistant cutting through the room again. His expression hardened into an even sharper mask of irritation than before, as though the earlier reprimand had bruised his pride far deeper than he intended anyone to know. He approached with an almost theatrical stiffness, carrying the clipped precision of a man determined to reclaim authority, and Elena knew immediately that his return would not be gentle, though she refused to let her posture waver even slightly beneath his looming presence. The assistant stopped only inches from her, lowering his voice to an icy whisper as he accused her of deliberately overstepping professional boundaries, insisting that she had manipulated the situation to gain personal favor with the family, and implying with a venomous tone barely concealed beneath polite phrasing that servers with her background sometimes forgot their place when shown even the smallest measure of kindness. Elena felt a sharp sting behind her ribs, but she kept her hands steady against the counter, refusing to grant him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch beneath such unwarranted cruelty. He leaned closer, reminding her that the Caldwell family was under immense public scrutiny, and that any interaction not strictly controlled could and would be interpreted as a threat to their privacy, almost daring her to deny his claim as he hovered uncomfortably near her shoulder. Several guests glanced over nervously, sensing the rising tension but pretending not to stare, and Elena felt a wave of quiet humiliation press against her chest, though it did not fracture her composure because she had endured harshness before and had long ago learned how to stand firmly in the face of undeserved judgment. Before she could respond, the assistant demanded that she immediately refrain from returning to the Caldwell table for any reason, stating that her continued presence would jeopardize the family's reputation, and that he was already considering filing a formal complaint with management regarding her unprofessional behavior. His words echoed with a brittle arrogance that belied his insecurity, yet Elena remained unmoving, letting him finish his tirade before she slowly lifted her gaze to meet his, her eyes calm, steady, and untouched by the venom he attempted to wield. She spoke with a quiet clarity that carried more dignity than volume, explaining that she had only offered kindness when kindness was needed, and that if providing comfort to an elderly woman in distress threatened someone's reputation, then perhaps the fault lay not with her actions, but with the fragile values guiding those who feared them. Her voice neither trembled nor wavered, and the assistant's expression faltered with the briefest flicker of surprise, clearly unprepared for her poised and measured response. Yet before the assistant could retort, the billionaire appeared once again beside them, his approach silent but his presence unmistakably charged, as though he had been observing long enough to decide that intervention was not only warranted but necessary. His expression carried a cold, controlled fury sharpened by protectiveness, and he positioned himself between Elena and the assistant with a deliberate finality that left no room for misinterpretation. He demanded, in a low, firm voice, to know exactly what the assistant believed he was doing, and the assistant stammered through a hurried explanation about safeguarding the family's privacy, though each word sounded increasingly hollow beneath the billionaire's hardening stare. The billionaire stepped closer, his tone gaining a quiet intensity as he clarified that Elena had acted with more integrity, compassion, and professionalism in a few minutes than many people in his employ had shown in years, and that any attempt to reprimand or intimidate her would be considered a direct violation of his personal directive. The assistant's face reddened with a mixture of humiliation and frustration, but he remained silent as the billionaire dismissed him sharply, ordering him to wait outside the restaurant until the car arrived, his tone carrying a finality that shattered any hope the assistant had of regaining control of the situation. As the man retreated with rigid, angry steps, the entire dining room seemed to exhale in relief, and Elena felt her own breath loosen, though her heart still pulsed with the echoes of tension and the surreal shock of being defended so fiercely by someone of such power. The billionaire turned toward her slowly, his expression softening into something far more human and sincere, and he spoke in a voice tempered by remorse as he apologized for the assistant's behavior, stating that such conduct was unacceptable and did not reflect the values he wished to embody, either publicly or privately. She assured him gently that she was all right, reminding herself to maintain the professional boundary that anchored her identity, yet the billionaire stepped closer with a subtle hesitance, lowering his voice as he confessed that witnessing her calm resolve in the face of unjust criticism had humbled him in ways he could not fully articulate. His gaze lingered on her for a moment long enough for the silence between them to thicken with something intimate and unspoken before he finally stepped back, offering her space while still letting her feel the gravity of his gratitude. The assistant's face reddened with a mixture of humiliation and frustration, but he remained silent as the billionaire dismissed him sharply, ordering him to wait outside the restaurant until the car arrived, his tone carrying a finality that shattered any hope the assistant had of regaining control of the situation. The billionaire returned to his mother's side, but not before glancing back at Elena with an expression that carried both admiration and an unspoken promise that their paths had intertwined for reasons neither of them fully understood, and that this morning's conflict had only deepened the invisible thread already drawing them together. The assistant's face reddened with a mixture of humiliation and frustration, but he remained silent as the billionaire dismissed him sharply, ordering him to wait outside the restaurant until the car arrived, his tone carrying a finality that shattered any hope the assistant had of regaining control of the situation. Elena resumed her tasks with deliberate composure, yet every movement felt infused with the quiet strength she had reclaimed during the confrontation, a strength shaped not by defiance, but by her refusal to diminish her dignity for anyone, regardless of their status. She focused on refilling water glasses and adjusting silverware, letting the familiar motions anchor her, yet her thoughts drifted repeatedly toward the Caldwell table, where the billionaire now sat with a posture that betrayed exhaustion, layered beneath suppressed worry. When she approached to discreetly check on them once more, the billionaire lifted his gaze toward her with an expression shaped not only by gratitude but by something more complex, something unspoken that stirred like a quiet tide beneath the careful composure he wore for the world. He asked softly if she could stay nearby for another minute, explaining that his mother seemed more relaxed whenever Elena was close, and though Elena hesitated for a breath, she nodded with a composed smile before positioning herself a respectful distance behind the table. The sunlight shifted slowly across the window, casting warm patterns across the marble floor, and Elena felt as though the entire room had slipped into a softer rhythm, one shaped by the fragile stillness that settled whenever a moment hovered delicately between ending and becoming something new. The billionaire bent closer to his mother, whispering something gentle in her ear, and Elena watched as the older woman lifted her hand to touch his cheek, a gesture filled with love and sorrow that carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of memories. He blinked rapidly, as if fighting back an emotion he refused to let spill in public, and Elena felt her chest tighten with a quiet ache, recognizing the pain of someone clinging to what remained of a bond slowly eroded by illness and time. After several long moments had passed, he finally stood with slow deliberation, smoothing the front of his suit as though bracing himself for the next stage of a day that had already unraveled far more than he expected. He thanked Elena once again, this time with a sincerity that wrapped around his words like a warm undercurrent, and asked whether she might give him a few minutes to speak privately with his mother before they prepared to leave. Elena nodded respectfully, stepping back with the graceful understanding of someone who knew when to give space without withdrawing her presence entirely. She moved toward the kitchen entrance, pretending to arrange a tray of utensils while keeping an unobtrusive, watchful eye on the table, feeling a quiet warmth in her chest as she observed the tender exchange between mother and son. Their whispered gestures, their intertwined hands, and the shared memories drifting between them created a small sanctuary of closeness that momentarily softened the world's demands, and Elena realized she was witnessing something deeply human, a son afraid of losing the one person who knew his heart before it was hardened by the weight of legacy. When the billionaire finally stepped away from the table, he approached her with a slower stride than before, as though each step required careful deliberation, and he paused just inches from her, his eyes carrying a depth of emotion he no longer attempted to disguise. He thanked her quietly, telling her that the morning would have been unbearable without her gentle intervention, and Elena felt her breath catch, because the sincerity in his tone touched something inside her that had remained dormant for years. Before she could respond, he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small envelope sealed with an understated elegance, placing it on the service tray beside her with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with the power he wielded so effortlessly in every other aspect of his life. When the billionaire finally stepped away from the table, he approached her with a slower stride than before, as though each step required careful deliberation, and he paused just inches from her, his eyes carrying a depth of emotion he no longer attempted to disguise. Elena touched the envelope with the edge of her fingertips, feeling the subtle texture of the paper and sensing the unexpected gravity it carried, though she forced herself to slip it discreetly into the pocket of her apron before returning to her tasks, unwilling to draw any unnecessary attention from nearby guests. As she assisted another table, she noticed the billionaire helping his mother into her coat with a tenderness that seemed to melt the last edges of his formidable exterior, and Elena felt a quiet admiration swelling within her, recognizing the rare glimpse of a man shaped not by wealth or influence, but by love rooted deeply in vulnerability. When he turned toward her for what she sensed would be the final time that morning, he offered a soft, lingering nod, one filled with gratitude, respect, and an unspoken promise that this moment was not the end of whatever had begun between them. Elena held his gaze only briefly, allowing herself a small, gentle smile before lowering her eyes in a gesture both humble and sincere, and as the Calderwells began making their way toward the restaurant's exit, she returned to resetting the table with a practiced calm. Yet her fingers trembled ever so slightly, because even before she opened the envelope in her apron pocket, she sensed that the billionaire had left more than a simple thank you inside it. She sensed he had left something that would alter the quiet axis of her life, something that would ask her whether she was ready to revisit a part of herself she thought had closed forever. And she had no idea whether her heart was prepared for the answer. Elena did not allow herself to open the envelope until the lunch rush softened and the dining room settled into its afternoon hush, yet even as she wiped tables and reset polished silverware, she felt the weight of it resting against her apron like a quiet heartbeat she could not ignore. When she finally slipped into the staff hallway near the back exit, where the noise of the restaurant faded into a muffled hum, she drew the envelope from her pocket with trembling fingers, hesitating for a long moment, as though opening it might unravel something far deeper than she was ready to face. She broke the seal with gentle care, unfolding a single sheet of stationery embossed with the faint crest of the Caldwell family, and the first sentence made her breath falter in a way she had not experienced in years. The billionaire's handwriting was steady yet careful, and his words carried a sincerity that felt almost too intimate for a man whose public life demanded distance, beginning with a simple thank you that held more emotion than any elaborate gesture could. He wrote that she had given his mother what doctors, treatments, and endless worry had failed to restore, a moment of clarity filled with joy, grounding him in a sense of hope he had not allowed himself to feel in months. Her eyes drifted to the enclosed plane ticket tucked neatly behind the letter, and the world seemed to slow as she realized its destination. Florence, departing in 2 days, paid in full with a quiet generosity that left her momentarily breathless. The letter explained, with a humility she had not expected, that he wished for her to return to the city she once called home, not out of obligation to him or his family, but because he sensed that part of her heart had been left there and had never fully found its way back. He wrote that kindness like hers deserved to be nourished rather than buried beneath routines, and that sometimes life extended unexpected invitations not to disrupt what was familiar, but to remind someone that they still carried pieces of themselves worth rediscovering. Elena pressed her hand against her chest, overwhelmed by the sudden tremor of memory images of sunlit windows, stone bridges, and soft laughter drifting through narrow alleys, memories she had spent years tucking gently into the quiet corners of her mind so she could continue moving forward. The idea of returning to Florence felt both terrifying and impossibly tender, like revisiting a chapter she had closed with careful hands, afraid that reopening it might awaken sorrow she had finally learned to carry without breaking. Yet, as she stood in the hallway, the faint scent of brewed coffee drifting around her and the hum of distant voices filling the quiet, she felt a warmth bloom within her that she could not ignore, a warmth born not from the gesture itself, but from the recognition it represented. The billionaire had seen her not as a server blending into the background, not as someone performing a duty, but as a human being shaped by love, loss, and the courage to offer kindness, even when no one expected it. And that, more than the ticket, more than the letter, softened something inside her she had long believed immutable. She folded the letter with careful reverence, tucking it back into the envelope as she stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, where sunlight washed across the sidewalk in soft gold, warming the tension still lingering beneath her skin. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the breeze brush gently against her face, and she felt her heart ache in a way that was neither painful nor heavy, but beautifully, devastatingly alive. She realized then that the story unfolding around her had never been about class or power, despite the differences that seemed to tower between them like distant mountains. It had always been about the quiet dignity of choosing kindness when no one was watching, about the thin, fragile threads that connected strangers through moments of vulnerability, and about the courage to let the past breathe again, even when fear urged her to keep the door closed. Elena opened her eyes slowly, exhaling a breath that felt like the release of years she had carried in silence, and she allowed herself a small, hopeful smile as she looked toward the city skyline shimmering in the afternoon light. For the first time in a long while, she sensed that something within her had shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the gentle certainty of a truth finally finding its voice. And she understood that no matter where the plane ticket led her, the real journey had already begun the moment she chose compassion over caution, offering her heart's language to a fading memory and discovering, unexpectedly, that her own had been waiting to be heard once more.